The vampire's dark desire. The neon lights of the city glowed like fallen stars, casting eerie reflections against the tall glass towers that defined its skyline. Beneath the dazzle of wealth and excess, an undercurrent of secrecy and indulgence pulsed through the veins of the metropolis, a playground for the nocturnal elite. At the heart of this vibrant jungle of vice and indulgence stood Lukas Blackwood, a man whose mere presence exuded dominance and seduction. He was tall, strikingly handsome, and impossibly magnetic, an immortal vampire whose legacy stretched across centuries. His empire of hotels, nightclubs, and high-end lounges catered not only to humans, but to creatures of the night like himself, allowing him to navigate his eternal existence with effortless charm. Yet beneath his perfect exterior lay a yearning, a deep, festering loneliness that no amount of wealth, power, or adoration could cure. The women who flocked to him, drawn to his intoxicating aura, only sought pleasure, luxury, or status. They whispered sweet nothings, feigned adoration, but none of them saw him, the man beneath the wealth, the vampire beneath the charm. They were nothing like the women he once loved centuries ago, when love had been tender, untainted by greed or self-interest. He thought of Elise, the first and only woman who had ever truly known him. Her laughter had been his sunlight, her touch the only warmth he had ever craved. She had been pure, not in naivety but in spirit, in her belief that love could transcend all things. And he had believed it too, until time stole her away. He had watched her wither, powerless to stop the march of mortality, unable to break the cruel cycle that dictated the lives of those he loved. When she breathed her last, something in him had shattered, leaving a wound that never truly healed. Lukas longed for something real, something beyond the fleeting pleasures of the present. He longed for a love untainted, one that mirrored what he had lost. But centuries had passed and the world had changed. People had changed. Innocence was a relic of the past, and true connection seemed like nothing more than a distant dream. And yet some part of him refused to surrender to that truth. He had lived for so long, yet he still found himself waiting for a love that he knew, deep down, would never return. Liliana's struggles. Liliana Carter had spent most of her life battling a different kind of darkness, one that clung to her like a second skin, impossible to shed. The bruises on her arms had long since faded, but the ones in her heart remained, deep, raw, and unforgiving. Her body bore the silent testimony of her suffering, scars hidden beneath long sleeves and layers of fabric, a desperate attempt to keep the world from seeing the evidence of her pain. She had mastered the art of concealment, wrapping herself in shadows, afraid that if anyone truly saw her, they would recoil in disgust. Her father was a tyrant, a man whose drunken rages left scars that ran far deeper than the physical. His voice had been a constant storm in their household, his hands a cruel weapon. Every step, every word had to be measured carefully lest she provoke his fury. There had been nights when she cowered behind locked doors, listening to the heavy thud of his boots, praying he wouldn't break through. There were times she had thought he might kill her, that she would never see another sunrise. But worse than all the bruises, worse than all the pain, was the helplessness, the knowledge that there was no one coming to save her. Her mother had been her only solace, the only warmth in a home that had long since turned cold. A woman with a fragile body but an unbreakable spirit, she had endured, shielding Liliana as best she could. But in the end, sickness had stolen her away, leaving Liliana truly alone for the first time. There was no one left to protect her, no one left to remind her that love still existed. And so she hid, behind long sleeves, behind forced smiles, behind the illusion of strength. But the ghosts of her past refused to be silenced, whispering reminders of everything she had endured, everything she had lost. The night her mother passed, Liliana made herself a promise. She would leave as soon as possible, if she wanted to live. She would build a life free of fear and misery, no matter the cost. But reality was harsh, and without a degree or a stable job, her options were limited. Her mother had been so proud of her for getting into university, But now, that dream seemed like a cruel joke. Graduation was approaching and Liliana was supposed to walk the stage, to see her mother's teary-eyed pride in the audience. Now, there was no one left to watch. Still, she had to survive. With no real work experience outside of scrubbing floors and taking care of neighborhood children, while juggling her university courses and her mother's worsening illness, finding a job that paid enough to keep a roof over her head felt impossible. She had no time for a full-time position before, no opportunity to gain professional skills, only endless exhaustion and the nagging fear that she would never escape the cycle of struggle. She took the first job she could find, a waitressing position at a dingy restaurant where the greasy floors were only slightly more revolting than the leering stares of the manager. The pay was meager, the customers rowdy, but she swallowed her pride and endured it because she had no choice. She needed to move out, needed to find a way to survive on her own. Every cent she earned was a desperate attempt to claw her way toward independence. After weeks of scraping by, she finally managed to rent a small apartment. A tiny, run-down space with creaking floors and walls that desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. It smelled of dampness and neglect, and the pipes rattled every time she turned on the faucet. But it was hers. No one could storm in. No one could scream at her. No one could hurt her. It wasn't much, but it was freedom. And for the first time in her life, she had a space to call her own. She continued working at the restaurant, forcing herself to endure the discomfort of the job because she had nowhere else to go. But the manager's wandering hands, once subtle, grew bolder. The first time he brushed against her, she ignored it. The second time, she pushed his hand away, her stomach twisting in anger and disgust. The third time he cornered her in the kitchen, a sick grin plastered across his face. Liliana's blood turned to ice as his fingers curled around her wrist. Panic surged through her veins, the same helpless terror she had felt so many times before, but she was not that scared little girl anymore. Without thinking, she grabbed a tray from the counter and swung it hard against his face. The crack of metal against bone echoed through the empty kitchen as he stumbled back, cursing. She didn't wait to see if he would recover. Her heart hammering, she ripped off her apron and bolted out the back door, lungs burning as she ran through the darkened streets. She didn't stop running until she reached the worn-out mattress in the tiny apartment she could barely afford. She curled up, shaking, knowing she was back at square one. Jobless. Alone. But for the first time in years she had fought back, and that at least was something. Desperation drove her to apply to every upscale bar, club, and lounge she could find. She needed something better, something that paid enough to let her finish university and keep a roof over her head. Each rejection email chipped away at her resolve, but she refused to give up. She spent hours hunched over her laptop, filling out applications between shifts, her fingers trembling as she hit submit for the 100th time. Every morning she woke up to the same uncertainty, wondering how much longer she could stretch her savings, how many more meals she would have to skip just to make rent. Little did she know that her desperate plea for employment had reached the desk of a man who could change her life forever. Lukas's shock. Lukas rarely involved himself in the hiring of staff. His HR team handled those trivial matters, and he was content to let them. But on this particular evening, his head of human resources, Daniel Hayes, entered his office with an unusual request. "Sir, there's a candidate who's applied to multiple of our establishments, across different locations, without even realizing they were all owned by you," Daniel said, placing a resume on Lukas's desk. Not much experience in hospitality, but she's persistent. Lukas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Someone applying this many times either desperately needs work or has an extraordinary drive. "Exactly what I was thinking," Daniel replied. "She doesn't have much of a professional background, mostly cleaning jobs and childcare. But something about her application stood out to me. She's determined, and honestly, I believe with the right opportunity she could prove to be an asset." "Such willpower must have a reason," Lukas murmured, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "A person like this, who fights to carve a place for themselves when the odds are against them, tends to be loyal when given a real chance. Daniel nodded. So, should we proceed with the interview? Lukas set the resume down, his decision made. Yes. If the interview goes well, hire her. I want to see where this determination leads. Liliana quickly adapted to her new position at one of Blackwood Empire's most prestigious nightclubs. The work was demanding, the nights long, but she threw herself into it with everything she had. The pay was far better than anything she had earned before, and for the first time in her life she could afford more than just survival. The nightclub was a world of flashing lights and intoxicating music, a place where people escaped reality. But for Liliana, it was the first step toward truly living. With the generous tips she earned each night, she kept her wages untouched, pouring them into fixing her tiny apartment. She spent her days scrubbing away years of neglect, peeling away old wallpaper to reveal the bare walls beneath, a canvas waiting to be reborn. The chipped tiles in the kitchen, the cracked mirror in the bathroom, the draft that whistled through the windows at night. Slowly, she tackled them one by one. She scoured thrift stores for furniture, bargaining for pieces that carried their own hidden stories. A second-hand couch, still sturdy despite its age. A wooden table that had once stood in a grand dining room, now hers to sit at, alone, but victorious. Every improvement, every nail hammered, and every brush stroke of paint was a testament to her perseverance. The place still wasn't perfect, the pipes still rattled, the floorboards still creaked, but it was hers, her sanctuary. Every night she would return, exhausted yet triumphant, knowing she had built this with her own hands, knowing that for the first time in her life, she was creating something that no one could take away from her. The first meeting. Lukas sat in his sleek, dimly lit office, sipping from a crystal glass filled with deep crimson liquid, a habit he had long perfected to mask his nature. Across from him, Daniel Hayes, his head of HR, stood with a knowing expression. "So how is our determined new employee settling in?" Lukas asked, setting the glass down with a soft clink. Daniel smirked. "Better than expected. She's got a fire in her, that's for sure. You don't see that kind of work ethic often. She's not just hardworking, she's sharp, fast, and keeps the customers engaged. You can tell she's got something to prove, and she's proving it well." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you like to see her in action?" Lukas arched a brow, intrigued. He had been mildly curious about this girl who had applied so relentlessly, but now, something about Daniel's tone made his interest sharpen. "Lead the way." They descended the elevator in silence, the doors opening to the golden-lit elegance of one of his high-end restaurants attached to the nightclub. As they stepped into the lively atmosphere, Lukas's gaze scanned the crowd, indifferent, until he saw her. The moment his eyes landed on Liliana, his entire world halted. She stood behind the bar, moving with effortless grace as she poured a drink, her dark, long curls catching the glow of the chandeliers. The determined set of her lips, the curve of her cheek, the intensity in her eyes. It was as if time had folded in on itself, resurrecting a ghost from his past. His chest constricted, the weight of centuries pressing down on him as he struggled to reconcile the impossible sight before him. Elise. No, not Elise. But the resemblance was uncanny, painful even. His mind warred with his instincts, logic battling the inexplicable pull he felt toward the girl who should not exist in his world. The room around him faded, the sounds of laughter and conversation muffled under the pounding in his ears. Daniel, unaware of Lukas's turmoil, leaned in. "Impressive, right? She's got the customers wrapped around her finger, and she's already made more in tips than most of the senior staff." Lukas barely heard him. His eyes never left Liliana as she turned, tucking a stray curl behind her ear, her expression momentarily softening as she laughed at something a customer said. His breath caught. The familiarity of it was like a dagger to his immortal heart. For the first time in centuries, Lukas Blackwood was shaken. He straightened, his voice measured but firm. "Have her come to my office after her shift. I want to speak with her." Daniel nodded, pleased, and walked off. But Lukas remained frozen, watching the girl who had just unknowingly altered the course of his eternity. Falling into the shadows, Liliana quickly became the star employee of the Blackwood Empire's most prestigious nightclub. She was efficient, hard-working, and entirely unaware of the attention she had drawn from Lukas himself. Lukas watched her from a distance, his golden eyes never straying far whenever she was near. He had told himself it was mere curiosity, an interest in a determined employee who had fought her way into his establishment. But deep down he knew it was more than that. The resemblance was too striking, the familiarity too unsettling. Every time he saw her, he was reminded of Elise, the woman he had lost to the cruel hands of time. And yet, Liliana was not Elise. She was her own person, strong, resilient, and entirely unaware of the spell she had cast over him. When her shift finally ended, Lukas made his move. "Send her up," he instructed Daniel, his voice firm. "I want to speak with her." Minutes later, Liliana stood in his office, her posture tense, her fingers subtly fidgeting at her sides. Lukas studied her carefully, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken challenge. Then he stepped closer. Liliana felt it immediately. The shift in the air, the sudden weight of his presence. He was impossibly handsome, but it wasn't just that. It was the way his golden eyes bore into her, as if they could see right through her, stripping away every layer of defense she had built over the years. It sent a shiver down her spine, an unfamiliar heat pooling in her stomach. "You've done well here," Lukas said, his voice a low, velvet caress. "Your work ethic is commendable." She swallowed, nodding. "Thank you, sir." "Lukas," he corrected. "I prefer you use my name." His presence was overwhelming, making it difficult for her to think. The air between them felt charged, like something unseen was pulling them together. Her heart pounded in her chest, though she couldn't tell if it was from intimidation or something else entirely. "You remind me of someone," Lukas admitted, his gaze never wavering. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Liliana hesitated, confused by the sudden shift in his tone. I'm not sure what to say to that." For a moment, neither spoke. Then, without warning, he reached forward, his fingers brushing against a loose curl that had fallen over her shoulder. The touch was light, barely there, but it sent a jolt through her body, her breath hitching in response. Lukas's expression darkened slightly, something unreadable flickering across his face. "You should be careful around men like me, Liliana." She blinked, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Are you warning me or yourself?" A ghost of a smirk played at the corner of his lips, but there was no amusement in his eyes. Only hunger, only longing, and something else. Something she couldn't quite place. She should have been afraid, but instead she was entranced. He watched her from the shadows, unable to resist the pull she had over him. Every movement, every flicker of emotion on her face, brought back memories of a past he thought long buried. He told himself he would keep his distance, that she was merely a coincidence, nothing more. But the hunger in him grew. One night after closing, Liliana found herself alone in the dimly lit lounge, wiping down the counter. She turned, and there he was, Lukas, leaning against the bar, watching her with that same unreadable expression. "You shouldn't be here alone," he murmured. She arched an eyebrow. "Are you worried I'll steal something?" A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "No, I'm worried about who might find you." She frowned, confused. "I can take care of myself." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I don't doubt that, but you don't know the kind of monsters that exist in the dark." Her pulse quickened. There was something in his voice, something ancient and knowing. "And are you one of them?" she asked, half in jest. Lukas reached out, trailing his fingers along a loose strand of her hair. "Yes," he whispered. The confession a dark promise. His voice sent shivers down her spine, awakening something she didn't quite understand, something dangerous yet intoxicating. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt drawn to him, as if the shadows themselves were calling her home. A love reawakened. The lines between them blurred in the days that followed, though not easily. Liliana was not the type to trust men, especially powerful, charming men who seemed to always want something in return. She had spent too many years learning that affection often came with a price, that kindness could be a mask for control. And yet Lukas was different. He never pushed her, never demanded anything from her. Instead, he watched over her from the shadows, offering quiet gestures of care without expecting anything in return. At first, she remained wary. She kept her distance, avoided his lingering stares, and tried to convince herself that whatever tension crackled between them was one-sided. But Lukas was patient. He sent her small, thoughtful gifts. Nothing extravagant, just things that showed he was paying attention. A book she had once mentioned wanting to read. A silk scarf in her favorite color. A simple pendant with a protective charm. Every gift came with no expectations, no strings attached, just a quiet promise that he saw her, that she mattered. And slowly, without realizing it, she began to let her walls down. Liliana, too, felt the shift. He was dangerous, intoxicating, yet there was a tenderness beneath his cold exterior. He protected her, cared for her in ways no one ever had. Liliana's life outside of work was changing too. Her hard work had paid off. She graduated from university, a moment she never thought she would get to experience. As she walked across the stage in her cap and gown, she felt a strange sense of pride and sorrow, knowing her mother would have given anything to be there. What she didn't know was that Lukas was there too, watching from the shadows, unseen yet ever present, a silent guardian, making sure she got the moment she deserved. That night, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions, she made a reckless decision. She went out drinking with some coworkers, letting loose in a way she never had before. One drink turned into several, and before she knew it, she was dialing Lukas's number with unsteady fingers. "Why do you keep doing this?" she slurred into the phone. "Why do you care about me? I'm just some simple girl." Lukas, immediately noticing the drunken haze in her voice, clenched his jaw. "Liliana, where are you?" "I don't know," she giggled. "But you always seem to find me, don't you?" And he did. Tracking her phone, he arrived at the bar in minutes, his presence like a storm as he carried her out before she could protest. She barely remembered the ride back, only the feeling of being held against a firm chest, of a voice murmuring reassurances in the dark. When she woke up, she was in an unfamiliar yet luxurious bed, the scent of coffee and something warm filling the air. Sitting up groggily, she found Lukas in the kitchen, cooking breakfast as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She rubbed her eyes, disoriented, her voice barely above a whisper. Did we? Lukas turned, his golden eyes amused but gentle. "You got drunk? Called me. And I brought you here to make sure you were safe. Nothing more." Embarrassed, she buried her face in her hands. God, I must have sounded ridiculous. He smirked. "You were honest." A beat of silence passed before Liliana exhaled shakily. "I don't get it. Why do you care so much? Why go out of your way for me?" Lukas placed a cup of coffee in front of her, his gaze locking onto hers with quiet intensity. "Because you're not alone anymore, Liliana. And you never have to be again." Something in her chest cracked open, something she had spent years trying to keep shut. And before she could think, before she could question, she leaned in. Lukas met her halfway, his lips brushing against hers with a feather-light touch, as if savoring the moment he had been waiting centuries for. The kiss started slow, testing, both of them caught in the pull of something neither could explain. His hand moved to her cheek, his fingers gentle, reverent, as if she might vanish like a dream at dawn. Liliana gasped softly at the sensation, her heart pounding as heat spread through her body. The warmth of his touch was in stark contrast to the coolness of his skin, an intoxicating contradiction that sent a shiver down her spine. Lukas groaned, the sound deep and low as he pulled her closer, his other hand settling on the small of her back. His restraint was slipping, centuries of longing unraveling in this single moment. She responded, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself to reality, to him. The kiss deepened, no longer hesitant, but desperate, raw and consuming. His lips moved over hers with a hunger that sent heat pooling in her core, his presence overwhelming, intoxicating. He kissed her like she was something precious, something he had lost, and finally found again. Liliana melted against him, her walls crumbling in the wake of his touch. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping her heart locked away, but Lukas was breaking through every barrier she had so carefully built. And for the first time, she didn't want to run. When they finally parted, breathless foreheads pressed together, Lukas's voice was barely above a whisper. "You haunt me, Liliana," he murmured, his golden eyes burning into hers. "You are the echo of a love I lost long ago." Her breath hitched. "Then stop fighting it." With a growl, Lukas claimed her lips again, this time with an urgency that left no room for doubt. He kissed her like she was his salvation, like she was the only thing anchoring him to this world, as if she were the missing piece of a life he had spent centuries searching for. Their love was a dangerous dance between the past and the present, between darkness and light, but neither could resist the pull. And so, in the arms of the vampire billionaire, Liliana found herself lost. And finally, found.